Moin Leute, herzlich willkommen zu einem neuen Video. Heute eine Reaktion, gab es lange nicht mehr auf diesem Kanal. Lasst doch gerne ein Like und ein Abo da. Heute reagieren wir auf, warum man in Minecraft keine perfekten Kreise mit Beacons machen kann, warum auch immer. Abonniert auch Scribble und ja, vielleicht
Hey
schaffen wir die
everyone, welcome
170.
back to the channel. Let me offer you a
Ach, und an alle, die jetzt Ferien haben, schöne Ferien an euch. Und an den Rest Weihnachten. Ja, habt einfach ein schönes Wochenende und ja, weiter geht's.
situation. You want to build a perfect ring of beacons. Whether it's on your survival world or a giant SMP full of a bunch of people, you need some extraordinarily pretentious and overtly exorbitant method of displaying your vast amounts of wealth. This means that you're only going to settle for the perfect ring of beacons and the perfect rainbow gradient to go all the way around you, because if you're going to go this far, you're only going to settle for the absolute best of what's available. Except you're not going to, because the amount of people who actually need this sort of information is close to zero, so it's best to probably treat this as a baking tutorial for a cake you'll never bake. But it doesn't
Okay,
matter, because I promise it's interesting enough
ja,
anyways,
macht
and who
Sinn.
cares if nobody's gonna make it? The idea is
Ja, aber mal, wie viele Beacon sind das? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 27, keine Ahnung, 100 oder so.
there, and this is what we're going to be talking about.
81, glaube ich.
So that means today's video is about
Ja, 100.
beacons, rainbows, why perfect beacon circles don't actually exist, and why making super imperfect
Weil in Minecraft normalerweise keine perfekten Kreise existieren oder Kugeln, was auch immer. Man kann schon welche machen, aber jetzt nicht einfach so.
circles like this one is the closest you'll actually ever get to making a perfect one. So where do we start? Well, it actually begins with the first beacon video, which was done about covering the ideas behind rainbow beacons, gradients, and all that jazz. This was centered about a specific survival project that I worked on in this half-baked survival world I ditched many months ago, but I essentially created this giant curtain of rainbow beacons. And it's actually a very natural progression to try and turn this into a circle, because we actually look at the band of colors. It actually starts with purple, right here, and also ends with purple. And this is just the way that the colors blend together. So it makes a lot of sense to take one side
Nee,
and
es
sort
fängt
of
mit
string it
Purple an und
around and
endet mit
hook it up
Purple.
into the other.
Weil du malst auch einen Regenbogen mit Rot außen.
The place it made the most sense to put was in the end dimension, right at the center of the
Aber ich weiß, was er meint. Natürlich, deswegen möchte man einen Kreis machen, weil ja die Farben auf beiden Seiten gleich sind. So.
island, because it's already kind of circular and I've already got a pretty big build going here. So I started to plop it down, but then I immediately ran into two problems. Number one is there's a lot of garbage around here, and I mean garbage as in full blocks, because just like in real life when you're creating lighting, you have to hide the lights and show what the lights are supposed to show. The problem is beacons have to be buried underneath the ground, and that means that you can't have any solid blocks above them, which means that they have to all be placed in spots where any beacon position can be swapped with either a carpet or maybe an endstone slab baked into the ground. The other problem is a lot more sneaky, and it essentially revolves around the idea that whenever you're trying to work with anything circular around in the Minecraft's three-dimensional cube grid is going to try and stab you in the back. The thing about circles in
Hauptsächlich ist
Minecraft
ja
is
ein
that
Kreis.
they're often thought about as really difficult, but they're
Sichtlich.
actually
Also
really
es
easy.
muss ja eine
Using any
Visionär einer sein. Ja, in Wirklichkeit braucht es ja nicht sein. Also ich verstehe jetzt nicht mal so ganz, worauf er hinaus möchte. Ja, wobei das ist, glaube ich, eine doofe Größe, die er gewählt hat. Die sieht scheiße aus. Es gibt Größen, die sind klein, schön, aber es gibt halt, dann gibt es so mittlere, die sehen kacke aus. Kommt auf die Quersumme oder so, keine Ahnung, drauf an, wie groß der Radius ist.
sort of computer program makes it super simple to generate any circle, and there actually just so happens to be a circle that contains 96 beacons, which is the exact
96.
amount required to
69.
achieve the full color spectrum we're trying
96. 96.
to create in this project. But unfortunately, this circle just isn't going to cut it, and the only way to see why is to actually build the beacons itself. I've changed these to light gray so it isn't absolutely insanely blinding, but you can still definitely notice the problem when you stand in the center and look around you.
Oh, schon geil.
Du guckst ständig YouTube-Videos und verdienst noch kein Geld damit? Dann schau dir hier mal an, wie viel Geld ich und viele andere mittlerweile tagtäglich.
Okay, maybe the problem isn't that glaring, but if you're going to go to this extent to create an incredible beacon ring, you're going to want to patch out every single possible error. And the error I'm trying to point out here is the inconsistency in the distance between each beacon beam. If you look directly in a cardinal direction, like this, you can see that the distance between the beams is fairly uniform. But if you move towards one of the more diagonal axes, you start to see these really big gaps. The reason this
Ja.
occurs is kind of obvious, but I'm going to explain it anyways.
Oh,
The thing about this is when
deswegen.
you're observing
Ja, dann
these
würde ich
beacons
einfach
right
in die
here,
Ecken
you
jeweils
only
noch
have to
eins
move
klatschen.
one relative block over to get to the next beacon beam from the perspective of the center. But when you move over to each of these moments where the block skips over, this distance becomes slightly different. As you can see, we can very visibly see when that skip
Ja, ist ja
happens,
logisch.
and it leaves a kind of horrible gap. This becomes more accentuated when you get to the diagonal sections, where it's essentially all skips, because you're going diagonally, that's just how the circle works, which leads to...
Also, exakt. Ja, also, es ist ja klar, das habe ich ja jetzt auch schon angesprochen, dass halt die Sicht, dadurch, dass es näher kommt, naja, halt so gemacht wird von einem 2D-Spiel, was 3D ist. Also, auch da, ich bin gerade mal überlegen. Also, auch dadurch verschärft, dass die betrachten dann die Diagonalen frontal und so minimiert man halt das Quetschen der Perspektive, weil das ja rein muss, aber trotzdem im Kreis sein soll, so, wisst ihr?
far more distance between the beacon beams here than there ever would have been between these single block jumps over here. And in order to resolve this problem, we need to actually stray outside of the standard circle given to us by computer programs over there in the back, and make sure every single beacon beam from the perspective of the center is exactly the same amount of camera turning degrees, like so, to get to the next one. And attaining that objective is what lands us with this incredibly sporadic beacon placement as described here. And if you look closely, this actually also resolves our other problem of being incredibly encumbered by the presence of a bunch of solid blocks everywhere, because we can actually get a lot more options than the original circle that we had created, allowing us to put beacons in places that tactfully avoid sections like this, where there are too many solid blocks obstructing possible beacon beam burial sites. Okay, this
Musstet ihr das Beacon-Strahlen durch Bedrock durchgehen, damit man sie auch im Nether platzieren kann?
idea is super fun and all, but how do we actually create this? Well, the way I chose to do it was I have this armor stand here, and every time I click this warped fungus on a stick, it rotates by a very small amount. That amount is 1/96th of a circle. Every time I click this other stick, it'll shoot out a little particle trail that will travel at exactly that line. And the objective is to simply go to every single 1/96th of a circle turn, and try and find a spot where that ray almost directly intersects the center of a block. In this way, each evenly spaced ray actually acts
Hier, das ist gar nicht mal so dumm. Also, ich wäre noch nicht drauf gekommen, aber es macht Sinn.
as the position where a beacon should be relative to where the player is, and this allows us to create that even spacing while still finding actual spots to put our beacons that lie within the cubic grid of
Da war ein
Minecraft.
Fehler.
And if we look closely one more time, we can see that for the most part, each of these rays is going to
Ja, aber es
intersect
geht hier nicht immer.
target block. At least for the most part. There are some ones that are slightly misaligned, but ultimately it doesn't matter in the super big grand scheme of things, it's really hard to notice. Now, a problem that might already be brewing in your head is the fact that a lot of these beacon beams are actually different distances away from the center. These ones are very close, while these ones are very far. What this actually ends up doing is decreasing and increasing the actual size of the perceived beacon beam due to it being farther or nearer. But ultimately, this doesn't matter a whole lot, nearly as much as the distance between beacon beams problem that we face with that
Das
light
sieht halt mehr
gray
nach einem
cylinder over
Quadrat
there.
aus, so, weißt du.
As you can see,
Das
it's
wäre
a lot
einfach
less noticeable than the other
einfachste, wie man
problem,
lösen
and
könnte.
certainly creates a far more pleasing effect. So now we've got the spots for where all the beacons lie. How do we actually implement the gradient?
Ja,
What I did then was installing a little sign on every single block that tells you which number it was. And then
36.
I simply assigned each of these numbers with a specific column of glass based on the big color feed tape that I showed off at the beginning. If you want to learn how these color gradients actually work, you can figure
Sag
it out based on
mal,
the
ist das
video
nicht,
that I
ich
made a while.
dachte, das ist scheißegal, ob du erst 5-mal rot packst, also 3-mal rot und dann gelb packst, oder ob du jetzt erst gelb packst und dann 3-mal rot, aber anscheinend ist es nicht egal. Krass.
Back. It's not very good, but it basically explains the topic. Then I went ahead and ported that to more easily visible concrete blocks, and made this big giant diagram for me to build and cross-reference in survival. Yes, this was kind of super tedious, especially drilling all the holes through the ground, placing all the transparent blocks, as well as placing every single perfect glass rod of color, but in the end it ended up creating this incredibly cool effect, which made it all worth it in the end. Another neat design choice I implemented is making the wiring to all these pistons, to the button that turns it on and off, incredibly sporadic. And what that ends up creating is this sort of warehouse light switch flickering effect that causes them all to blink off in completely random order, which just leads to a very nice opening and closing animation.
Naja, geht besser.
Anyways, that'll be it. If you want to see more
Aber
stuff
ich
where I'm
wollte
actually
gerade.
explaining things, even though the rest of
Schon
my
schön.
channel is more redstone oriented, I definitely have a lot of content that's centered in this style. If you want to have a chat with me,
Ja, das war's. Wenn ihr mehr von diesen Videos sehen wollt, dann lasst doch gerne ein Like und ein Abo da. Kommentar schadet auch nicht für den Algorithmus. Und wir kriegen hoffentlich mit diesem Video die 170 Abonnenten voll. Das würde mich freuen. Und ja, dann schönes Wochenende, schöne Ferien, was auch immer. In den Ferien werde ich wahrscheinlich zumindest Montag, Dienstag, Mittwoch, Donnerstag und Freitag täglich ein Video hochladen. Aber ich weiß noch nicht ganz so was. Also es wird Minecraft sein, aber was weiß ich nicht. Das Intro, by the way, lasse ich weg, weil ich habe erstmal noch ein Problem mit so. Es ist noch nicht ganz perfekt, ja. Also ich musste erstmal was machen und dann können wir schauen, ob das Intro da sein soll oder nicht. Aber wenn es euch gefallen hat, das wisst ihr ja schon. Like, Abo, bla bla bla, habe ich gerade schon gesagt. Das war's. Macht's gut. Ich mach's besser. Ciao.